We're here at Kurt Bolden's Hydro Lab during a CDS course, and we're talking about document drying and packing out. So, all right. So when it goes on to it, small amounts of documents can be dried. Now, documents, when you got files laying on people's desks, laying on the floor, and they get wet, for the most part, if the ink has run, it's going to stay run. It's not going to go back into spots. Any stainage it picks up from flooring or whatever else is going to stay stained. When it comes out, they will be in pretty good shape. They will not be 100% perfectly flat, but they'll be very readable. If you want it to be 100% original, you can actually, after we dry it, we can go ahead and put it on a copy machine and photocopy it. Now always remember, if they have digital versions and can simply reprint, that's going to be a lot cheaper than drying anything out there. So it's always the first choice. Like I tell people, don't try and restore a photograph if you've got good negatives. Reprint photographs off the negatives. In this particular case, if you can regenerate the paperwork, great. But what happens if these are hand sketches of crime scenes in a court of law? What if they're testimonials? Or in this particular case, hand-generated invoices? These things cannot be digitally reproduced. So they're either lost to the garbage can or they're dry. And the whole concept of drying them. Now, first thing, like I said, anything ink has run will not run back. It's not a miracle machine. Anything that has wrinkles or distortions or any type of stainage in it, it will be there afterwards. The difference is it will be dried. First thing you want to do is find out from these files, are there any photographs in these files? If there's a photograph in this file and you dry it with the photograph in here, the photograph face, the emulsion on that photograph is going to stick to this paper and the photograph will be ruined. Okay? So if you have photographs, if you have x-rays or any type of material like that in here, negatives, print negatives, film negatives, you want to take them out of here and handle them separately. The most important thing to remember is if you've got a small amount of files, it's not too bad. You're bringing 1 or 2 boxes from the house, we're going to bring 1 or 2 boxes back to the house. If we have a large amount of files, 30, 40, 50, 100 file cabinets, 4-drawer file cabinets all over this office building, how do you make sure that this file gets back into that file drawer, in that file cabinet, in that office from whence it came? Always mark it, okay? So the concept of it is, I generally like to do like 1 box per file drawer, or if the file drawer is larger, obviously 2 boxes per file drawer. And what you're going to do is mark the box from where it came. The date, what is in it, files. Where did it come from? Mr. Jones's office, 5th floor, 3rd file cabinet, or how are you identifying the file cabinet? However he identifies the file cabinet is how you identify the file cabinet. That way you make sure it all goes back. 2 other important things to remember. Files may be public. In other words, there's no big issue with anybody seeing them. Files may also be medical records, legal records, or whatever else. And in that particular case, our biggest issue is we fall under the Privacy Act of the United States of America, which means these files need to be contained in a system. So the best thing to do is work with a records manager. You get a records manager from your local library, or you can join a group called ARMA, A-R-M-A. It's a Record Management Association, and you can hire a records manager out of there part-time to come on out to your job and basically ensure that everything is packed properly and then handled properly, and any paperwork covering it will make sure that it's all handled and we haven't violated the Privacy Act. Last thing you want to have is somebody going into medical records, finding out information on an individual and then distributing that information out there. You can imagine how it is. You know, with these days with YouTube and everything else, things get everywhere. So remember to protect the privacy. Also, you may have files at the FBI, files in the police department. Those files may not even be able to leave the building. One of the things we have as an option of is a vacuum freeze drying piece of equipment that can actually come inside the building, operate on 240 volt single phase power, and dry on that site in high security type areas. So look for any type of material that will stick to the paper, photographs, any type of x-rays, film strips, negatives, whatnot. As long as you're ensured that these files do not contain those, the easiest way to do it is to set the box in the beginning on its end, and you're basically looking at 1.5 or 1.2 cubic foot type banker box. You want the handles on the side with the cover over the top of it so that it's nice and secure. It's easy for us to move them around. They're basically uniform so they can fit on a pallet, be shrink wrapped and taken care of. And always remember, label the box from what was in it and where did it come from, so we know exactly when we're loading them in. So if you tilt the box on the side, it kind of starts out a little easier. You can have 3 or 4 people doing this process, but basically all the files bottom down just like they would be in the file drawer, and then you just kind of start it out in here. There we go. And now once you get it going, you can set it up on something and just keep on loading. Now the question is, how tight do I want the files? If you're going to air dry them, one of the big issues is you need a certain amount of airspace in between them, so the files are packed a little looser in milk crates. And when that happens, the desiccant system will dry, or even LGRs will dry the documents well, but the problem is, since they're packed looser, what's going to happen to the paper? It's going to do what? Wrinkle and shrink and cause issues with it. The nice thing about vacuum freeze drying is when you put them into a box, you can pack them in here nice and tight. So you pack them in as tight as you can, and when you do that, what's going to happen is, as we continue to go with it, the compression of the documents is basically going to stop them from wrinkling as much. So you're going to get a much nicer fit, or a much nicer look after you're drying them for vacuum freeze drying the documents. So truly a preferred method, very simple. The most important thing is, like I said, make sure there's nothing in there that'll be ruined, as in it's got a coated film on it that'll stick to the documents, and make sure you identify where they came from, right down to what file cabinet drawer, in what file cabinet, or if they were taken off the desk or the floor, what office, who has them, where they go back. Because the biggest problem is making sure everything goes back to where we actually took it from. It's the records management side of things. So files are pretty straightforward. There's no extra special care taken with these other than pack them tight and make sure that you don't have any type of photographs or whatnot involved in it. You just slide it on down the line, put the top cover on that, and off she rolls. So we're good to go at this point in time. When you're packing them on a pallet for shipping, these boxes are pretty strong. We generally recommend no more than 2 high boxes, maybe 3 at the total outside. Otherwise than that, what's going to happen is the weight of the top boxes will start crushing the bottom boxes, and then we're going to have all kinds of mess when it gets back there. Because remember, the truck is going to do what? Bounce down the highway. Okay? So good thing to have looking at. Now, when we're dealing with books, what we've got, any type of book, we've got to pull them on out and find out a few things about them. Number one, the face of it comes in many different types, the cover of the book. We don't have to terribly worry about that, because what's going to happen is we're going to wrap it in freezer paper. Now normally we have a dispenser that has an automatic cutter on our freezer paper. In this particular case, we're going to simply just use a good old razor knife and cut it. This is what we call butcher paper or freezer paper. The problem with wax paper is that the waxy film, when it warms up, may transfer to the cover of the book, and we don't want to have that happen. So basically what you're looking at is you just take it in the freezer paper, and now no matter what the cover of the book is, it's protected. And we're going to drop this book right in here with the freezer paper. So always do your triage by, first thing to do is look at the paper, look at the condition of the book, make sure it's valuable enough to be worth saving. As long as it's a non-coated or non-shiny paper, all you have to do is wrap the outside.
What if it's autographed?
That could be a difference. You could get a book that's maybe 100 years old autographed by a famous author, a baseball star, or something like that, a sports memorabilia book autographed by the whole team that won, the pride of the Yankees or something like that.
Or by Jacques Cousteau.
And that's exactly it, yeah. Jacques Cousteau himself signed it. The whole question is, what is the value there? Remember, this is contents insurance, and people have a limit on their contents insurance, so you got to get a pretty good idea of what the estimate's going to be. So, like again, first thing to do, value of the book, whether the paper is coated or not. Also look at the binding. If it's older and the binding is yellowed and it's starting to break down, the older glues are basically organic glues. They made from rabbit skin, they've made from horse hair, horse glue, and that type of thing we've all heard of. When those glues get wet, they degrade. And then when they dry, but unfortunately if they've degraded enough, you may very well have sections of the book come on out. So you have to tell the customer that that's a possibility. Now, can that book be rebound? Absolutely. You can take a book that's almost destroyed and send it to a conservator and they can reproduce it. But again, is it worth it? We had this magnificent Bible. Thought that it was worth a fortune. 700 pages thick. Fabulous illustrations throughout the entire Bible. I went online, put in the author, pulled it up on eBay, $69.95. 150-year-old Bible, fully illustrated. It's not even worth the savings. It's much cheaper to buy another one at $69.95. So the concept of it is make sure what we're drying is worth drying.
A lot of those old Bibles have family trees in them, though.
That's the concept of it. Then you're going back to intrinsic value over, sentimental value over intrinsic. So the concept of it at that point in time is we need to look at it. Okay, Mrs. Jones, it's going to be about $100 to dry this Bible, or $200 to dry this Bible. Do you want to spend that or not? Yes or no? It's a very simple question to ask them. Now, just remember, when you're packing out the books, basically 1.2 cubic feet, books this size, you're probably talking 8 to 10 books. You can get much smaller books. You pack many of them in there. Always pack them paper to paper, bind the binder down, so the back of the book is always facing down. And again, what you want to do is just keep on fitting them in here until it's nice and tight again. Do not worry about putting books on the top. If you've got books across the whole bottom and you lay this thing in there on the top of it, then what's going to happen is it's going to have room to expand and warp before it gets frozen and you can lose the book. So do not overpack the boxes. Just put them spine down across the box all the way. Alrighty, when it comes down to it, like I said, 3-man team or 3-person team, 3-woman team, whatever it happens to be, somebody cutting the paper, somebody diagnosing the books, and then someone packing the books in the box, and again, mark the boxes. Did this come from the library? When we packed out the Miami-Dade Public Library System, we packed out 5 libraries after Mr. Andrew came rolling through in 1992. 5 libraries, 285,000 books packed out by hand in 5 libraries in 3 days. Loaded onto 18-wheelers, refrigerated transport, up to Cocoa, Florida, where we blast froze them at a frozen food facility and then pulled them out and they were held there. The beauty part is, if people are unsure of how much value it is, what we can do is package them and freeze them. And then if they determine that the value is much easier to go ahead and replace it, the value is not worth the full drying amount, we bill them for the packaging and the freezing, but we don't have to worry about billing them for the drying, repackaging, and reshipping back to their facility. They can be disposed of. If you leave the book wet for 3 or 4 days while you're waiting to make a decision, you have made the decision. The book is no longer going to be restorable. It has degraded to the point. If it's wet enough, it can be saved. As a matter of fact, in Miami-Dade, we were actually pulling out books that had sat wet in a wet library for 10 days. We only packed out 285,000 books. That sounds like a lot, but in 5 libraries, that's a very small amount. We took 10% of the books. How do you triage books in the library? You ask the librarian,
Yeah.
what are the most valuable books? And if it has any type of microbial growth on it, and you're not worried about that book, then let's go ahead and pack it away. And we're going to go ahead and get it dried, valuable and clean. Then we go to the books that may have contamination. Can you save a book that's covered in mold or has been immersed in sewer water? Yes, it can. Does the cost go up? Yes, it does, because now we're talking about some type of cleaning method to render it back safe again. These are all options and add-ons depending on the cost of the book. So when it comes down to it, 285,000 books packed out by hand, hand-selected by the librarians to tell us which ones were the most valuable ones. What we basically did was we packed them into it. We had the library name, so we know which of the 5 libraries it came from. And then basically the next simple part of it was fiction, nonfiction, simple on the library. And then basically after that was it reference and the Dewey Decimal System. On the numbers of the Dewey Decimal System, from this decimal, Dewey Decimal Code to that Dewey Decimal Code is written on here, and we know exactly what's in this box. So when it gets repacked, we know exactly how to repackage it. So when it goes back to the customer, they look at this and go, ah, okay, West Kendall, nonfiction, Dewey Decimal System numbers here. We can simply take this box to that part of the library, and they can take it right out of the box and stick it right back up on the shelf. Any questions?
When you freeze them, how do you pull the moisture out of the,
The book?
Yeah.
Excellent question. The process is called sublimation. What I was telling you guys a little earlier is if I took that piece of wood, soaked it wet, threw it in Antarctica, it would eventually dry. Only because there's ultra low grains in Antarctica. Well, in this particular case, we do better than just that. We not only freeze the book and have a cold atmosphere that it operates in, what we're actually doing is using a chamber where we're going to draw a vacuum on. So what we do is we lower the atmosphere in the chamber, the atmospheric pressure to near zero or at zero. And what happens at that point in time is there is no energy, there's no more or less air molecules or water molecules floating around in the space around the book. So it's incredibly what? Low vapor pressure air when it comes on down to it. The process of sublimation is, if you've ever seen dry ice, the reason why they call it dry ice is because it never gets wet. It never sees its liquid state. It goes directly from a frozen carbon dioxide directly into the gas. Well, when we lower the vapor pressure inside, when we lower the atmospheric pressure inside this chamber to zero or near zero, as you can get mechanically, it's like outer space. So now what happens is when the book is wet, even though it's frozen, it still has a lot more energy than the space around it because it's a vacuum around it. And of course, what have we learned? Second law of thermodynamics, high energy always goes to low energy. So what actually happens is the high energy relative to no energy almost in the air in the chamber of the frozen water in here will sublimate directly off. So the book never gets re-wetted in the dry vacuum freeze drying process. Whereas if you desiccant dry the book, or if you go ahead and LGR or refrigerant dry the book will go from frozen back to liquid water, where more damage can happen to the book as it dries. So in this particular case, it's frozen. Any ink runs are frozen. There is obviously not going to be any mold growth because it's frozen. So what happens is the book is static at that point in time, and then it sublimates dry in this negative pressure. And when that happens, you don't get the re-wetting, so there's no further damage occurring to the book or the documents.
How long does that take?
How long is the process? Yeah.
There we go. Excellent question. Basically, it takes approximately a week. It depends on how wet the books are, thickness of the books, and a few other things. One of the things we have at Insight is a computer-controlled drying system that actually has, shall we say, sensors to make it simple enough on the racks and on the books, so that what we can actually do is look and see how things are drying. Also what happens is we see pounds of water removal by the system as it's computed by the machine. So we can start seeing a lot of water removal and then a little water removal, and then all of a sudden water removal stops. When water removal stops, and our sensors are giving us the right number, we know the books are dry. Generally, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 7 days. It may be as short as 4, kind of depends on how wet the books are and the documents.